Behind polished glass and polished smiles, a black man stands where he should be seen, but remains invisible, his presence questioned, his worth dismissed without a word. Every polite refusal, every silent exclusion, builds a wall around him, tightening like a noose disguised in civility. But this is no ordinary story of quiet discrimination. Beneath the surface, a storm brews, a truth so powerful it threatens to unravel the very foundations of a system designed to erase him. Who is this man, shadowed yet unbreakable? And what secret does he carry that could bring down those who thought they controlled the narrative? If you crave stories that peel back the layers of injustice and reveal the raw fight for dignity, hit like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Join the conversation, because this story isn't just his, it's ours all. Oswin Mercer stood in front of the Klein Federal Bank branch's tall glass doors, the morning sun catching on the building's mirrored surface, reflecting back a world that didn't quite see him. Dressed in a dark tailored overcoat and slacks, he held a leather-bound portfolio under one arm and exhaled into the brisk morning air. With calm precision, he leaned forward and placed his face in front of the biometric access scanner mounted beside the entry. A green light blinked once, then turned red. A quiet beep sounded, followed by an on-screen message that read, "Face not recognized. Please try again." Oswin didn't move at first. He adjusted his stance, stepped a bit to the left to catch better lighting, and tried again. Read again. He lowered his hand to tap the help button beneath the scanner, but it did nothing, just a dead press with no sound, no signal. He glanced to his left as a young white man in joggers and a branded puffer jacket approached the door, pressed the exact same button, and was instantly granted entry. The scanner barely blinked. The door opened for him like it had been waiting all morning. He didn't pause. He didn't look at Oswin. He just disappeared inside. Oswin gave the door one more try, but again, the system rejected him. He took a step back and looked up at the security camera that watched the entryway. It was active, functional, seeing everything and doing nothing. From the inside lobby, a woman in a crisp navy suit and platinum blonde hair emerged, holding a tablet in her hands. Her gaze swept across the lobby, then caught sight of Oswin through the door. She didn't open it. She simply lifted her tablet slightly higher, revealing a new sheet of paper hastily taped to the glass. Clear facial recognition required. No loitering permitted. Oswin frowned, but remained composed. He raised his ID badge, pressed it gently against the glass, making sure she could read the metallic federal seal. She looked at it, then at him. Her face didn't change. No reaction, just a long, blank stare before she turned and walked away. No words, no acknowledgement, silence. After 10 minutes, standing in the cold, a side security door hissed open, and a stocky guard in a tactical vest stepped out. He looked at Oswin like he was a question that had already overstayed its welcome. "You waiting for someone?" he asked, not offering his name or assistance. "I have an appointment," Oswin replied, voice steady. "With who?" the guard asked, narrowing his eyes. Oswin paused, mindful of confidentiality protocols. "Operations." The guard nodded once, slowly, like it didn't really matter. "Need you to step away from the door. Can't block the entry." Oswin blinked, confused. "I'm not blocking anything. I'm just—" The guard cut him off by stepping forward, pointing to a red square painted on the pavement 10 feet away. "Over there." With a silent sigh, Oswin walked to the marked space. Just a painted square. No seat, no shelter, just a patch of concrete that seemed to mark where people like him were supposed to stand. A minute later, a middle-aged white woman carrying 2 lattes arrived. She scanned in and entered without delay. Then another customer, and another. Each walked past without so much as a glance in his direction. He could see them through the window, see the warmth of the lobby, the polished floors, the welcome desk, the bright signage. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't causing trouble. And yet, he remained outside, the invisible man no one dared to notice. After nearly 20 minutes, the same receptionist who had ignored his badge earlier walked past the front doors again. This time, she stopped, hesitated, and buzzed the lock open without a word. No greeting, no apology. Oswin stepped inside. Warmth embraced him, but it felt no more welcoming than the cold. He walked toward the check-in kiosk. The touchscreen interface blinked to life. He held his badge up to the reader. Rejected. A red warning flashed. Unregistered visitor. Security check required. The receptionist gestured for him to wait, again offering no explanation. She made a call on her headset, whispering quietly, glancing sideways at him twice. Within moments, 2 more guards arrived, one of whom had already spoken to Oswin outside. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't ask questions. They simply moved toward him and said, "Sir, we need you to wait off to the side while we verify some information." They didn't offer a seat. He stood awkwardly near the corner of the welcome area, a space just large enough to be ignored in. As he waited, a nearby customer walked by, giving Oswin a quick glance. As he waited in what should have been a neutral public space, he began to notice details that felt increasingly deliberate, like pieces of a machine designed not just to function, but to filter, discourage, exclude. At precisely 8:47 a.m., a young female employee in slacks and a gray fleece jacket walked briskly toward the wall-mounted policy board near the entrance. She tore off the top page and replaced it with a freshly laminated sheet. Oswin's eyes flicked toward the motion, casually at first, then narrowing when he read the new edition. In small, bureaucratically bland font beneath the line regarding prohibited items was a single sentence: "Improper office attire may result in service refusal." It was a subtle change, carefully worded, completely subjective, and impossible to refute without seeming combative. He looked down at his pressed slacks, his overcoat, his polished shoes. Nothing casual, nothing unprofessional. But the guard from earlier, the one who had ushered him to the red square outside, now stood with arms crossed near the corner of the lobby, watching him silently. When he noticed Oswin reading the new sign, he stepped forward and, without saying a word, walked to the velvet rope barrier separating the waiting area from the teller counters and slowly unhooked it, pulling the barrier closed between Oswin and the rest of the floor. It was a move so mundane that no one noticed it except Oswin, and it was done with such precision, such wordless finality, that it felt like a door slamming shut. Behind that rope, 2 smartly dressed customers were being escorted toward the premium client section, complete with upholstered seating, complimentary coffee, and wireless charging stations. Oswin remained where he was, a few feet away, but now symbolically and visibly segregated. He did not argue. He did not ask questions. He simply watched and waited, his face unreadable, but his silence growing heavier. Minutes passed. A janitor appeared from a side hallway, pushing a mop bucket, humming softly to himself. He wore headphones and bobbed his head lightly to music only he could hear. Oswin nodded politely as the man neared. The janitor gave him a quick glance, then veered sharply toward the row of chairs where Oswin sat. With a quick flick of his wrist, he appended the mop bucket just a foot in front of Oswin's shoes, spilling a thin layer of dirty water across the polished floor. Oswin instinctively pulled his feet back. The janitor didn't apologize. Instead, he immediately set down a bright yellow wet floor sign, then began mopping furiously, pushing the water toward Oswin's chair with careless strokes. The fluid lapped near Oswin's shoes again. He stood up, stepping aside to avoid the grime. The janitor's mop handle swung too wide, brushing against Oswin's side. Still, there was no apology, just the hum of music and averted eyes. The janitor moved on, leaving behind a thin slick across the area where Oswin had been sitting. There were no other chairs available. The receptionist, who had seen the entire episode, glanced up briefly from her station, then looked away, tapping something into her computer. Oswin remained standing, his portfolio still clutched in one hand, the other tightening slightly as he adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. The invisible script of exclusion continued to unfold around him, with each action crafted just carefully enough to avoid direct confrontation, but each one undeniably pushing him further to the margins. Customers continued to come and go, all seamlessly guided, processed, welcomed. No one else had water spilled on them. No one else had a security rope drawn between them and access. No one else stood idly, because the only dry chair was now off limits. He eventually moved to a corner near the entrance, where the tile was dry, and stood silently as the clock ticked toward 9:10. A nearby employee rolled out a service cart offering water bottles to waiting clients. She skipped his corner entirely, passing within feet of him without making eye contact, though her cart rattled loud enough to draw his glance. Every movement, every micro-decision made by the staff echoed with the same rhythm. Pretend he isn't there. Ignore without rejecting. Exclude without naming. In the far side of a lobby, a digital board advertised the bank's commitment to diversity and inclusion. Stock images of smiling clients flashed across the screen. Families, professionals, entrepreneurs. None looked like Oswin. The irony was so sharp it might have cut someone else. But Oswin didn't smile. He stood quietly and watched the machine turn. He checked his watch. 45 minutes had passed since he arrived. His appointment time was already nearly half over. Still, no one had called his name. No one had acknowledged his presence. A middle-aged man in a blue suit, clean-shaven, confident, approached the front desk. The receptionist immediately rose, shook his hand, and escorted him behind the rope Oswin had been kept from. But he hadn't left. He couldn't, not just because of his assignment, but because walking out would mean letting them win. That was what this was, a quiet war of attrition, a test of dignity wrapped in sterile professionalism. Inside the staff-only side of the bank, just beyond the frosted doors leading to the executive hallway, a junior associate named Maddox watched Oswin from a distance. His face split into a mocking smirk as he discreetly pulled out his phone. In the employee-only group chat labeled Klein FAM, Maddox snapped a blurry photo of Oswin standing against the wall and typed, "Another VIP from the street." Almost instantly, the thread lit up. A string of laughing emojis followed, along with a few flame icons and one poorly edited meme of a shopping cart with Oswin's head superimposed over it, captioned "Urban Inspector, Undercover at Klein." One of the loan officers added, "Ask him if he's here for the leftover donuts from last week's diversity panel." The group chat exploded with reactions. No one questioned the tone. No one defended the man in the photo. No one paused to consider the implications of mocking someone they hadn't spoken to, hadn't served, hadn't acknowledged except through a screen. They had already made up their minds. And once a story begins in whispers, it gains power through silence. Maddox leaned back in his chair and decided to take it one step further. He pulled up a form template labeled Client Behavior Reports, a rarely used function in the bank's internal system meant for documenting unusual or disruptive client actions. Without hesitation, he filled in the fields with vague but inflammatory details. Client appeared agitated. Refused to provide appointment details. Lingering near the entrance. Potential conflict history. Flagged once at Eastern Branch for loitering complaint, see attached. Maddox hit submit. He didn't attach anything because there was nothing real to attach. But the system didn't require verification, not for internal memos. Once the entry was logged, the report auto-synced to the morning's security file, quietly embedding itself into the internal dashboard. Now, under Oswin's visitor profile, a red, flagged indicator blinked beside his name. By the time the floor supervisor refreshed her tablet, that note was already present. She read it, nodded slightly, and adjusted her posture. She didn't look surprised, just quietly affirmed. As Oswin stood unknowingly in that corner, his digital shadow was being altered, twisted, and cemented in a place where truth was whatever the internal narrative said it was. 10 feet away, the receptionist leaned in to whisper something to the floor manager. Oswin couldn't hear the words, but he could tell by the glance aimed his way, by the way the manager's expression tightened, that the conversation was about him. Something untrue had been passed along, and he felt it like a shift in air pressure. The floor manager nodded, whispered something back, and walked off. No one approached Oswin, but the glances intensified. The eyes that passed over him now carried judgment, the kind that moved from confusion to suspicion. In the back office, Maddox was still in the group chat. Someone had added a new comment. Bet he's one of those fake complaint guys who comes in and tries to bait employees for lawsuits. Someone else responded, "We should notify loss prevention just in case. These people know how to make things look like discrimination." Another laughing emoji. Another dismissal of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they were exactly what they were mocking. The casual cruelty was cloaked in sarcasm and in-jokes, passed around like office candy. And while Oswin remained outside that circle, still unacknowledged, his presence was being redefined behind closed doors. He wasn't just invisible now. He was being actively reshaped into something unwanted, something dangerous. By 9:37 a.m., a printed memo had arrived at the assistant manager's desk. It was short, no more than 3 sentences, auto-generated from Maddox's internal form. It read, Client Mercer, Oswin previously flagged for potential disruptive behavior at another regional branch. Recommendation, observe with caution. Document interaction if necessary. The assistant manager read it once, then added a handwritten note. Keep him away from priority clients. Do not escalate unless provoked. She underlined it twice and placed it in the attention folder on the security desk. No one asked to file the original report. No one contacted the Eastern Branch to confirm the incident. It existed now, and that was enough. Oswin shifted his weight again, now standing for nearly 35 minutes since his chair had been rendered unusable. He clutched the portfolio tighter, though the contents, compliance forms, audit criteria, and internal protocols felt suddenly irrelevant in a place where reality bent so easily. He noticed the guard had been staring at him longer now. Not watching, staring. Not out of curiosity, but like someone trained to anticipate escalation. Oswin gave no reason to suspect anything. He had not spoken, not raised his voice, not disrupted any process. He had only waited. But inside the bank's internal system, he had already been tried, misjudged, and found wanting. And the next time someone looked at him, they would no longer see a man waiting. Nothing violent, nothing overt, just the slow, cold churn of humiliation being administered one layer at a time, each insult quiet, measured, and institutional. A security guard passed near him again, this time stopping beside the front desk to whisper something to the receptionist. She nodded, reached into a drawer, and pulled out a yellow clipboard with a stapled form attached. She walked over to where Oswin stood, not looking him directly in the eye, just enough to imply engagement without commitment. "I'm going to need you to fill this out," she said, her voice a practiced monotone. Oswin looked at the form. The top line read, "Income verification access to priority services request." Beneath it were a series of fields asking for tax returns, employment letters, asset statements, requirements completely irrelevant to someone there on official business and unheard of for anyone else in the building. He raised his eyes slowly and asked, his voice low, "Is this required for all waiting clients?" She hesitated for a split second too long. "Just for access to the priority lounge," she said, gesturing toward the cushioned seating area 10 feet away, separated from the main floor by low partitions and branded gold carpeting. Policy update. Oswin didn't move. He didn't take the clipboard. Instead, he scanned the lounge. It was half full. Young white professionals sipping lattes, checking their phones, reading investment pamphlets. Not one of them had been handed a form. Not one was being asked to justify their existence. Still, the receptionist stood there, clipboard extended, her hand rigid. Refusing would make him combative. Accepting would make him complicit. Oswin chose neither. He turned slowly and walked 2 steps to the side, removing himself from her reach without a word. She stood still for a moment, then dropped the clipboard back onto the counter with a quiet but audible snap of frustration. She didn't push the issue further. She didn't need to. Her job wasn't to escalate, it was to isolate. Above Oswin, a row of massive LED display screens hung from the ceiling, playing muted marketing videos in a continuous loop. He hadn't paid them much attention earlier, but now, under this sudden push for verification, they demanded his notice. The screens displayed stylized footage of happy clients banking at Klein Federal, young families hugging in front of new homes, smiling couples in freshly leased luxury vehicles, business owners shaking hands across gleaming marble desks. Every single person in every single clip was white. Their clothes were bright, their faces open and joyful. They moved in slow motion through softly lit scenes backed by piano music that no one could hear, but everyone could somehow feel. Between the clips, black text on white backgrounds flickered in and out of view, where your story begins. Then another, not for everyone, just for the right ones. Oswin blinked. He was certain that phrase hadn't appeared earlier in the loop. Just for the right ones. It felt less like a slogan and more like a judgment, an echo of everything unspoken that had already been acted upon. He turned slowly and scanned the room again. On the wall above the teller stations, another sign had gone up, a digital banner labeled Preferred Client Program. It listed benefits such as expedited service, zero wait time, private advisors, and access to exclusive rates. The entry requirement? Subject to internal eligibility criteria. That phrase again, undefined, impossible to challenge. Internal, unquestionable. The receptionist had returned to her desk, now quietly chatting with a colleague. They kept their voices low, but Oswin noticed the way they occasionally glanced at him while whispering. He knew the tone well. It was the kind reserved for people whose presence required explanation, for people who didn't quite fit the visual narrative a place wanted to project. The murmurs, the glances, the forms, it was all part of the same theater. He was no longer being served. He was being filtered out slowly and methodically. At the other end of the lobby, a white man in a wrinkled polo shirt and paint-stained jeans approached the desk. He didn't carry anything. He didn't appear to have an appointment. He mumbled something, laughed at his own joke, and the receptionist smiled brightly before waving him through. Oswin watched not with surprise, but with grim recognition. That man didn't get a clipboard. He didn't get a form. He got a pass. Because he didn't break the image. Because his presence, however casual, still aligned with what the system had quietly deemed acceptable. Oswin turned again, this time facing the entrance. His own reflection stared back from the mirrored glass. A man in a clean suit, graying beard, calm eyes. Someone who looked like he belonged anywhere. Yet in this building, he was being treated like a potential intruder, an anomaly that couldn't be assimilated. And no one, not a single staff member, had addressed him by name. Not once. Not even to mispronounce it. Oswin Mercer, despite the steady drip of indignities that had accumulated against him throughout the morning, maintained a composed exterior. He pulled a well-worn leather-bound notebook from his portfolio, a silent testament to his lifelong discipline, and opened it carefully to jot down notes about what he observed. Staff behavior, layout of the floor, the way security personnel shifted positions, subtle cues in the system's operations. This wasn't just any notebook. It was a tool honed through years of compliance work, his way of taking control in situations where power was otherwise denied. Yet, the moment a staff member noticed the movement of his pen across the pages, a ripple of unease spread. A young employee at the reception desk noticed Oswin's actions, her eyes narrowing as she whispered into her two-way radio. Within moments, a pair of security guards approached him, their expressions unreadable, but their posture unyielding. One of them spoke low enough to be heard only by Oswin. "We need you to stop recording any internal layouts or activities." Oswin, who had written nothing confidential, felt the weight of their demand like a blunt force. But more humiliating was what came next. A directive that Oswin must publicly flip through every page of his notebook in front of the gathered customers and staff, as if under inspection. The crowd, an unspoken jury of clients, bank employees, and passers-by, turned their attention toward him. He opened the notebook slowly, turning each page with deliberate care, exposing his personal observations and notations. The movement was awkward and demeaning, a performance scripted by an invisible hand to portray him as suspicious, perhaps even dangerous. Faces in the crowd exchanged quick, judgmental glances. Some smirked, others whispered. Oswin caught fragments of comments, words like spying, security risk, overstepping. The staff pretended to be professional, but the message was clear. He was no longer a client. He was a spectacle, a problem. The very notebook that embodied his professionalism was twisted into evidence of a threat. Later that day, during an afternoon team-building exercise in a cramped conference room just off the main lobby, employees gathered in semicircles around whiteboards and projection screens. The game was called Client Profiling by Appearance, a supposedly light-hearted way to foster teamwork, but steeped in implicit bias and institutional stereotyping. A manager held up a printed photograph of Oswin, taken surreptitiously from one of the lobby's many security cameras. "Here's a new profile," he said dryly. "What kind of client do you think this is? What account type?" Several hands shot up, though the answers were pre-scripted. One employee blurted, "Probably a negative balance account." Another snorted and added, "More like a liability." Laughter filled the room, some nervous, some mocking. The manager smiled thinly, nodding as if encouraging the stereotype rather than challenging it. No one questioned the premise. No one defended Oswin or suggested the exercise was inappropriate. Instead, the game normalized an institutionalized mindset that equated appearance with risk, a mindset that Oswin himself had become the unfortunate embodiment of. Throughout the day, Oswin remained on the fringes of this orchestrated theater of exclusion. He was not invited to meetings, nor was he allowed to speak freely with staff. When he tried to approach the service desk for updates on his appointment, he was met with cold detachment, polite deflections, and reminders to wait quietly. His professional history, his role as a regional compliance director, was invisible here. Instead, he had become the subject of whispered conversations, security alerts, and the butt of crude jokes behind closed doors. Each moment was calibrated to break his resolve, to turn patience into frustration, and dignity into humiliation. Yet, despite all this, Oswin held firm. He refused to let their tactics provoke him into anger or withdrawal. He understood the stakes far beyond his personal discomfort. He was here not only for himself, but for every client who had ever been marginalized, dismissed, or erased by a system that refused to see them as whole human beings. Late into the afternoon, Oswin found himself standing near the lobby's main entrance once more. The preferred client lounge was now empty, its plush chairs vacant as the day's last customers trickled out. The large digital banners that had broadcast exclusionary messages earlier now cycled through corporate slogans about integrity, inclusivity, and our commitment to you. The irony was unbearable but unnoticed by most. He closed his notebook, its pages heavy with notes and silent testimony. The quiet of the bank settled around him like a shroud. His gaze met the receptionist across the room. For a moment, she looked away quickly, but not before the faintest flicker of recognition passed through her eyes. Oswin understood that behind the polite smiles, the procedural barriers, and orchestrated humiliations, the system had been working tirelessly to deny him even the most basic acknowledgement. But he was still there, still standing, still present, and he would remain so until the truth was no longer deniable. At 10:15 a.m., a mid-level manager named Graham, known among the staff for his icy demeanor and strict adherence to unwritten rules, appeared quietly behind the reception desk. His eyes swept the room, lingering on Oswin with a faint, unreadable expression. From a neat stack of printed papers, he pulled one out, a carefully crafted document styled as an official internal interview invitation. The letter was addressed to Oswin Mercer, citing a scheduling conflict with his supposed appointment and requesting his immediate presence in an upstairs conference room for a rescheduled meeting. The paper's crisp quality and formal formatting gave it an air of authenticity, but the tone was neutral, almost coldly bureaucratic. Graham approached Oswin with a blank smile that betrayed nothing but carried the full weight of its intent. "Here," Graham said quietly, extending the paper. "They need to see you upstairs. There's been a mistake with your original schedule." Oswin took the invitation without a word, feeling the cool weight of the paper in his palm. There was no room for argument. The implication was clear. This was not a rescheduling to accommodate, but an attempt to sideline. The meeting was a pretext to keep him away from the floor, away from the very people and processes he was there to inspect. As Oswin prepared to stand, an unmarked door near the lobby opened, and a young IT technician emerged, her ID badge swinging from a lanyard. She glanced at Oswin, then down at a tablet she held, tapping quickly before disappearing back inside. Unbeknownst to Oswin, within minutes, his presence had triggered a flurry of activity in the bank's back-end systems. His credentials were quietly altered in the internal database, his visitor profile updated with a new code, OSMNR monitor. This was an internal designation rarely seen by anyone outside security and IT. The profile was flagged as a special risk profile, indicating that his movements, communications, and interactions should be closely observed and documented. The new tag wasn't a reflection of any real behavior, but a preemptive label designed to isolate and monitor. In the security office, monitors flickered with Oswin's face on multiple screens. The live feeds were now cross-referenced with behavioral analytics, software programmed to alert if certain risk behaviors were detected. Loitering, note-taking, unauthorized access attempts. A quiet alarm blinked on one console. It was an automated reminder to staff that Oswin's presence warranted heightened scrutiny. Meanwhile, Oswin was led to the conference room upstairs, a sterile environment bathed in cold fluorescent light. The walls were bare except for a small plaque noting the room's purpose, executive review and compliance oversight. The irony was not lost on him. Inside waited a bank supervisor he barely recognized, a woman named Elaine who exuded the same corporate chill as Graham below. She handed him a clipboard with a questionnaire designed to probe his purpose, his authorization, and his legitimacy. The questions were pointed but dressed in neutral language. Please specify your department. List all individuals you have contacted during this visit. Detail your compliance authority within the regional oversight framework. Oswin answered with steady precision, aware that every word would be logged, analyzed, and possibly twisted to serve a narrative he had yet to see. Behind the door, a faint murmur from the IT room indicated that his electronic devices were being scanned, his communications monitored in real time. His phone, still in his pocket, was silently pinged by security protocols designed to track location and signal any unsanctioned data transmission. Despite the isolation, Oswin's mind remained alert, piecing together the magnitude of the operation against him. The atmosphere was charged, heavy with the weight of unspoken intent. Moments earlier, back in the security control center downstairs, a high-priority alert had been triggered within the bank's internal monitoring software. The algorithm, finely tuned to detect any anomaly among visitors and staff, had flagged Oswin's digital credentials as carrying an overriding clearance level far above that of an average client or even many employees. The alert blared silently through encrypted channels, reaching the eyes and ears of a select few senior executives and compliance officers. The message was stark. Individual holds executive clearance, regional compliance, director override request denied. No manual override could mask this fact. The system was designed to be impartial and unyielding. It did not care for the social calculus that had pushed Oswin to the fringes of the lobby. It only recognized his authority and the implications of his presence. Meanwhile, upstairs, the door to the conference room clicked softly and locked behind Oswin. The projector, previously dormant, snapped to life as if on cue. The first slide displayed the bank's official logo alongside the title, Unannounced Audit Initiative Klein Federal Branch Compliance Review. The room remained silent except for the faint whir of the projector's bulb. Then the second slide appeared. It was a high-resolution photograph of Oswin himself, dressed immaculately in a tailored navy suit, his expression steady, confident, standing side by side with the national CEO of the banking conglomerate during a recent executive conference in Washington, D.C. The image was accompanied by a caption in crisp, bold font, Oswin Mercer, Regional Compliance Director, Western Division. The projection system illuminated the room with a soft glow that highlighted the disparity between the man in the photo and the one currently confined within these walls. There was no fanfare, no announcement, no rush of realization. Instead, it was a quiet revelation broadcast to an empty room, a silent declaration of Oswin's true identity that transcended the daily performances of exclusion and dismissal he had endured. At that moment, Oswin understood that the system itself was now unveiling the truth on his behalf. It was as if the bank's own mechanisms were forcing transparency on those who had sought to conceal his authority. This revelation was not merely symbolic. It carried tangible weight. Elsewhere in the building, security personnel received encrypted updates that Oswin was no longer just a visitor. They had to treat him as an executive with all the privileges and restrictions that status entailed. The digital locks and surveillance protocols shifted instantly. His movements, once shadowed and restricted, were now subject to direct oversight from the highest compliance officers. His access rights were reinstated at a level far beyond what anyone had presumed. Yet paradoxically, the same layers of surveillance intensified. Oswin was now both recognized and scrutinized more deeply than ever before. The bank's hierarchy was forced to acknowledge his position, but continued to regard him with suspicion, wary of the power he wielded and the scrutiny he could bring upon their operations. Upstairs, Oswin remained seated as the slideshow cycled through more images, official letters, compliance reports, and his professional biography, each slide reinforcing the undeniable fact of who he was and why he was here. He allowed himself a brief moment to breathe, to absorb the contrast between the impersonal digital portrait and the human experience of exclusion that had marked his day. As Oswin re-entered the main lobby, the environment subtly transformed around him. The digital name display board, which only moments before had blinked past countless other names in a mechanical loop, now showed a singular, unmistakable message glowing in bright, authoritative letters. Welcome Oswin Mercer, Regional Compliance Audit Officer. The luminous text reflected across the polished marble floor and onto the faces of the waiting customers and staff, many of whom froze mid-action, caught off guard by the abrupt declaration. A security guard, who had earlier been one of the more indifferent observers, paused as he passed beneath the sign, his eyes narrowing. Across the lobby, a receptionist quietly stepped away from her station and moved to the glass entrance doors. Her fingers tore down the faded loitering threat notice that had been taped there earlier, a relic of the unwelcome assumption that had plagued Oswin since his arrival. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into the trash bin, her face unreadable, but her movements deliberate and precise, as if erasing an uncomfortable truth from public view. Meanwhile, Oswin made his way to a discreet corner of the lobby, where he had earlier left a small, unassuming USB drive on a vacant chair. The device contained hours of footage recorded covertly from a miniature camera concealed within his jacket lapel, evidence of the subtle, unrelenting campaign against him. Staff mocking him behind closed doors, security cameras catching the moments he was ignored or misjudged, and the fabricated incidents that had been used to justify his exclusion. With steady hands, he retrieved the USB and handed it to a trusted compliance officer who had arrived quietly on the scene, someone who had remained neutral throughout the day. The officer slipped the device into a laptop, and the screen immediately filled with video clips. One after another, scenes unfolded. A staffer rolling eyes as Oswin approached the help desk, a whispered conversation about the man who thinks he can audit us, a security guard shaking his head knowingly as Oswin waited in the wrong area, and several brief but telling moments where bank employees exchanged smirks and laughter behind his back. The clips did not capture shouting matches or overt confrontations. Instead, they revealed the insidious nature of institutional bias. Small gestures, offhand comments, and systemic silences that collectively formed a powerful narrative of exclusion. As the videos played, Oswin watched with quiet intensity, recognizing the depth of the deception and the degree to which the institution had tried to erase not just him, but the very principles he represented. Word of the projection and the exposure of these videos rippled quickly through the staff. Managers who had earlier dismissed or ignored him were now forced to confront the reality their systems had betrayed. Some avoided eye contact, others whispered fervently behind closed doors. A palpable tension filled the air, thickening the usually neutral atmosphere with anxiety and anticipation. At the front desk, a digital bulletin board that once advertised new client services now displayed a scrolling message: "Compliance audit in progress. Full cooperation required." The phrase was terse but loaded with meaning. This was no ordinary review. It was a reckoning. Staff members who had previously flouted policies or acted on personal biases were suddenly aware that their actions were under scrutiny, cataloged and undeniable. The bank's upper management moved swiftly to contain the damage. It dissected the sequence of events with surgical precision, outlining the systemic failure of leadership at the Westworth branch. The tone was grave, yet unambiguous. It detailed how the branch's management had not only tolerated, but seemingly orchestrated an environment where a high-ranking official was deliberately marginalized and humiliated. The evidence compiled, video footage, staff reports, internal communications, all pointed to a culture steeped in bias, exclusion, and willful neglect. The memo concluded with a strong recommendation for immediate termination of key personnel and a temporary suspension of the branch's operational autonomy pending a full investigation. At the helm of this unfolding storm stood the branch director, Richard Caldwell, a man whose career had been marked by cautious advancement and a knack for navigating corporate politics without ruffling too many feathers. When the initial message landed in his inbox, his face tightened, lips pressed into a thin line as he scrolled through the damning evidence. He rose abruptly from his office chair, the leather creaking under the sudden movement, and made his way toward the lobby, the weight of impending consequences pressing down with every step. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for his phone, intending to make an urgent call. But as he lifted the device, a cold, mechanical voice interrupted through the overhead intercom. "Attention, all staff. The Westworth branch is now under temporary compliance control. Access is restricted to authorized personnel only." The front doors of the building, previously open and welcoming, slid closed with a resonant hum, locking firmly behind him as he exited. A new security protocol had been activated, one that placed the entire branch under the supervision of the regional compliance team. The reality was unmistakable. His authority was effectively suspended. Outside, the glass facade reflected the late afternoon sun, but inside, a sense of containment prevailed. Employees who had previously moved about with casual assurance now whispered anxiously in clusters, their conversations punctuated by furtive glances toward the security desks and the conference rooms where compliance officers were already convening. The IT department, once silent, began systematically disabling non-essential access, securing sensitive data, and rerouting communication channels through secure lines monitored by external auditors. Oswin watched all of this unfold with a measured patience. The very system that had sought to undermine him was now compelled to place itself under scrutiny. The branch director's attempt to regain control was rendered futile by the protocols that Oswin's presence and evidence had triggered. Meanwhile, the compliance officers on site wasted no time. They moved swiftly to interview staff, review logs, and assess the extent of the discriminatory practices uncovered. Their questions were direct, their demeanor professional but unsparing. Several employees who had once laughed at Oswin's presence now found themselves under a microscope, their actions cataloged and their words recorded. The atmosphere was tense, heavy with the weight of accountability. 1 week had passed since the Westworth branch was placed under the harsh scrutiny of a regional compliance team, since the flood of damning reports, internal memos, and covert footage shattered the carefully maintained illusion of order and fairness within those walls. The bank, once a symbol of corporate stability and community trust, now stood as a silent monument to both failure and the possibility of redemption. As the sun rose on a crisp morning, the street outside the branch looked unchanged at first glance. Pedestrians hurried past, cars rolled along the asphalt, and the distant hum of city life pulsed steadily. But those who paused to look closer noticed the transformation. The familiar glass facade of the bank had been stripped away and replaced by panels of reflective, mirrored glass. No logos adorned the building's exterior. Instead, where the name of the bank had once been proudly displayed, a subtle engraving now caught the morning light. In delicate, understated script were the words, "We failed to recognize human dignity." This engraving was both a confession and a promise, a stark acknowledgement of past wrongs and a commitment to change. The message was unadorned, unembellished, carrying the weight of truth without fanfare or excuse. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet but charged with anticipation. The interior had been gutted and redesigned, stripped of the old trappings of privilege and exclusion. The plush chairs, velvet ropes, and digital screens broadcasting polished advertisements were gone. In their place stood a space dedicated to transparency, education, and community engagement. It was now officially designated the Center for Ethical Banking and Inclusion, a hub for training, dialogue, and restorative practices, all overseen by none other than Oswin Mercer himself. Dressed immaculately in a tailored black suit, Oswin stepped confidently through the main entrance. The mirrored doors slid open effortlessly, greeting him not as an outsider, but as the man in charge. There was no security guard to block his path, no receptionist to question his presence. The old staff who had once whispered behind his back and dismissed his authority were gone, replaced by a team aligned with a new mission. The automated system's gentle, synthesized voice echoed through the lobby. "Welcome back, Director Mercer." It was a greeting that marked not only his return, but the return of integrity to a place that had once lost its way. Oswin paused for a moment to absorb the weight of that simple phrase. He thought back to the long hours of silent exclusion, the orchestrated humiliations, the fabricated reports, and the systemic efforts to erase him. Each step of that journey had brought him here, to a space where dignity was recognized and protected. As he moved deeper into the center, Oswin was greeted by members of the community, clients, advocates, and new staff, each carrying their own stories of struggle and hope. Together, they embodied the promise of a future built on equity and accountability. The walls bore plaques and photographs honoring those who had fought against discrimination and those who continued to champion fairness in financial institutions. In a quiet corner, a digital display cycled through testimonials from individuals who had once felt powerless but had found their voices through the center's programs. Oswin understood that the fight was far from over. The systems that perpetuated bias and exclusion were deeply entrenched and required ongoing vigilance. But the transformation of this branch was a beacon, a testament to what was possible when truth was met with courage and institutions were held accountable. The engraving on the building's facade served as a daily reminder. Recognition of human dignity was not optional. It was the foundation of justice and trust. Oswin stood before a newly convened advisory board, composed of community leaders, legal experts, and bank officials, preparing to launch the center's first public initiative. A series of workshops aimed at educating employees and clients alike on implicit bias, equitable practices, and the importance of transparency in financial services. He looked out at the faces in the room, each person a partner in this mission. His voice was calm but resolute as he spoke of lessons learned and the road ahead. Outside, the mirrored panels reflected the city waking up, the sunlight catching on glass and steel, a reminder that transparency was a two-way street. What had begun as a singular act of exclusion and erasure had become a catalyst for meaningful change. The building was no longer a fortress of privilege, but a center of empowerment and inclusion. And as Oswin Mercer walked through its doors, he carried with him the message that justice, while often quiet and slow, was enduring. The silent verdict had been delivered, not with noise or spectacle, but with steadfast commitment to righting wrongs and honoring the dignity of all. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more gripping, real-world inspired narratives. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about the plot? Did any part resonate with you or surprise you? And where are you watching from? Share your location and comments below. Let's start a conversation about justice, dignity, and the fight against systemic bias. Your support means a lot.